So Nikki Bremner asks from McCarthy Holden, what do we legally need to do with deposits of over 5 weeks?
So one, for new tenancies entered into on or after the 1st of June, don't take more than 5 week or 6 week deposit, depending on the annual aggregate rent. So just don't do it. That will automatically become a prohibited payment. For existing tenancies, and this is where the transitionary provisions between fees and deposits differ. So for existing tenancies that renew after the 1st of June, and that's contract signed after the 1st of June, on or after the 1st of June, you will have to refund anything in excess of, God, excuse me.
Somebody just scored.
Sorry. Thought I'd switch that off. So for tenancies that renew on or after the 1st of June, and that's where the contracts are signed on or after the 1st of June, the renewal contract, you will need to refund anything in excess of 5 or 6 weeks of the new rent. And I think the new rent is quite important because you're not going to be giving back effectively a week if you've taken a 6 week deposit, because if the new rent has gone up, you'll be holding 5 weeks of the new rent, not 5 weeks of the original rent. So do think about that. There is a deposit calculator already on 2 of the 3 schemes websites. I understand on the 3rd scheme it will be coming shortly, so that you can double check what the right figure is. You will then have to refund anything in excess of that. So I use the example of £100 a week rent and a 6 week deposit taken at the moment. So you'll have taken £600 and protected £600. If you keep the rent at the same £100 a week, once the bank comes in, you will have to refund £100. But if you increase the rent to £120 a week, 5 times £120 is £600. Therefore, you won't have to refund anything. So think of it like that. That's for renewal tenancies, and you will have to refund the money within 28 days of signing the renewal tenancy. For contractual and statutory periodics, you don't need to do anything. So if you let the property, let the tenancy drop onto a statutory or contractual periodic, once the ban comes into force, and for example, you've taken a PET deposit, so you've got an 8 week deposit, you don't need to do anything about that until the tenancy comes to its natural end. So i.e. it's either renewed at some point later down the line, or the tenancy vacates. So something agents might want to think about, particularly where they've got existing tenancies with pets, where they've got a higher pet deposit, you might want to consider leaving a tenancy to drop onto a statutory or contractual periodic, because then you can keep that higher deposit. Or you renew it and put a pet premium onto the rent. That's up to you.
Great. Now, Andrew Maunder from AJ Homes Limited asks, can you confirm on what grounds the initial holding deposit, the 1 week's rent, can be withheld from a prospective tenant?
Certainly. So there are 4 grounds. Yes, 4 grounds that the holding deposit can be withheld. Number 1 is if the tenant pulls out. So if for any reason the tenant pulls out of the tenancy before the contract is signed, the prime example is they take 5 different properties, they put down 5 holding deposits and then decide which one they want. They will lose 4 of those holding deposits. So if the tenant pulls out, they forfeit the holding deposit, and it is forfeiting the holding deposit in full. So you can hold it all. You can give back part of it if you would like, but you can, where a holding deposit is forfeited, it forfeits the whole amount. So number 1, tenant pulls out. Number 2, also relatively simple, the tenant fails a right to rent check. So if the tenant, you are not lawfully as agents or landlords allowed to let a property to somebody that doesn't have the right to live in the United Kingdom, and therefore if they fail that right to rent check, they forfeit their holding deposit. Number 1, number 2. Number 3, if the tenant provides false or misleading information. Now, false or misleading information is not failing referencing. So if they provide completely accurate information but still fail referencing, that will be classed as the landlord or the tenant pulling out, and you'll have to return the holding deposit. However, if they have actively lied, and most importantly, you can prove they have actively lied, you can withhold the holding deposit. Now, the obvious examples of this are, how much do you earn? Oh, I earn £35,000. Do the referencing? Oh, no, you don't. You only earn £25,000. Another one, do you have any county court judgments? No, I have no county court judgments. Oh, yes, you do. You haven't paid utilities on the last property and you've got 3 utility county court judgments. You don't need to be able to prove whether the tenant knew it. So if they say, oh, I didn't know I'd got 3 county court judgments, that's irrelevant. It was discussed at length in Parliament, but it was decided that an agent will never be able to prove whether or not a tenant knew they had a county court judgment. Yeah. If they've said they didn't, but it turns out they did, false or misleading statements. But you must be able to prove the lie. If you can't prove the lie, you can't withhold the whole deposit. And this is where application forms come in. Now, make sure, and this is something that if you haven't done it already, go to your referencing agency and find out exactly what questions they ask as part of their referencing, and then make sure your application form or your reservation form, whatever form you use that you get the tenants to sign, make sure that mirrors the questions exactly, so that you can say, we asked you this question, you said this. The referencing agency found exactly the same information, same question, and got different information. You have lied. Most important one, I would say, that one, and the sort of prime example, is how much do you earn? Now, how much do you earn is a very subjective question. Are you asking basic salary? Are you asking on-target earnings? Are you asking actual earnings? Are you including car allowances, bonuses, other commissions? And therefore, make sure that whatever question the referencing agency is asking, you are asking the same one when it comes to earning. Because you could say, how much do you earn? Tenant puts down their on-target earnings. The referencing agency then just does it based on basic salary. The tenant hasn't lied. They've just given you different information, but it was still accurate information. You won't be able to withhold it. So make sure, whatever, particularly on the earnings question, what is your referencing agency going to ask? Make sure you ask exactly the same question so that you can then prove it. It's why, as part of our tenant fees toolkit, we haven't been able to put a template application form together, because every referencing agency asks the question slightly differently.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Then didn't I? Sorry. The final one. So we've done pulls out, fails right to rent check, provides false or misleading information. The final one is where they don't enter the agreement by the deadline. So what the government expects is agents to go from taking the holding deposit to entering the agreement, signing the contract and dating it, within a period of 15 calendar days, what is known as the deadline for agreement. If the tenant isn't getting the information back to them, if the tenant is dragging their feet effectively for whatever reason, and you hit day 15, they forfeit their holding deposit, off you go. Yeah. Similarly, though, if the landlord or the agent that's not getting the stuff done, not replying to the tenant's phone calls, not replying to tenant emails, and we hit day 15, you have to give the holding deposit back. Okay. So that deadline for agreement is really important. You can extend the deadline for agreement by whatever length of time you so wish, as long as you have mutual consent, i.e. both the landlord and the tenant agree to extend the deadline for agreement. But if you breach that deadline for agreement, you have to give the money back. If the tenant breaches the deadline for agreement, they lose the money.
Great. I think that deals with the question actually from James Sherritt I was about to ask from Harvey Scott. But we've got before I move on from this section, we've got a couple of questions around time wasters. Nicola Bean, for example, at Letting Zone, saying they don't take holding deposits from prospective tenants, but how do you propose she can avoid time wasters? Take
a holding deposit.
Right.
Sorry. And that is, it's designed to stop time wasters. Right. That's what happened in Scotland. In Scotland, they don't have holding deposits, so tenants took 5 or 6 properties off the market, agents did loads of work, and then they selected the property they wanted. In England, if they do that, they will lose most of their holding deposits. Well, they'll lose all bar one holding deposit.
Yeah.
So that's
and just sorry, go on.
It's the legislation is there to stop the time wasters.
Yeah.
So you don't do it now.
Fine. And interesting question from Twitter, actually, from Danny Atkins, who says, it sounds from what you're saying as if like a tenant could actually damage a property intentionally and the landlord still has to pay for it to be repaired. That doesn't seem fair on landlords.
That isn't changing from the situation as it is now, and actually as it has been since the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985. What we were worried about with the Tenant Fees Act, and what we were arguing very strongly against, was that the landlord wouldn't be able to recharge those costs to the tenant immediately. Under the early drafts of the Act, it looked, or the bill as it was then, sorry, there was the distinct possibility that landlords would have just had to pay that cost up front. So, you know, going back to my earlier example of the nappies, they'd have to pay to unblock the toilet, but then couldn't actually recover that money from the tenant until the end of the tenancy. Under the damages provisions which are within the Act now, they can. So it actually doesn't change the situation from where it has been since the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985 was introduced.